Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1, action.
Assume nothing.
Brash, bald-faced blasphemy.
Question everything.
I find it extremely hard to imagine.
Open your eyes.
It is quite all right to be an atheist.
The fastest growing group of people in the country has been measured as being those who have no belief or who are atheists.
You don't have to be apologetic or quiet about it.
Challenge the opposition.
You see religion on 100 fronts losing the argument.
And start thinking. This is The Thinking Atheist Worldwide.
Our broadcast today brought to you by Nature Box, ridiculously delicious snacks filled with flavor, not filled with all the junk, and delivered right to your door. 50% off your first box right now when you log on to naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. FYI, I am moving a couple of chess pieces on the show schedule. The Alternative Medicine Show was originally scheduled to air next Tuesday, but I'm going to bump it to the 8th of March. So it's coming, but we're going to bump it a few weeks, and here's why. I was presented with the opportunity to chat next Tuesday with an astrophysicist. His name is Dan Batcheldor. He recently spoke at the Florida Free Thought event down in Orlando, and it was just terrific. He's done a lot of work with NASA and in other capacities, and he is a really smart guy who's working on a project that's going to make it easier for the rest of us, you know, those of us who don't have PhDs in astrophysics, to explain stuff like the Big Bang, how we're all made of stardust, the evidence that overwhelmingly disproves the young Earth, you know, Ken Ham's young Earth, etc. Jocelyn and David Williams down in Florida, they put the convention together and they brought his project to my attention, and I had to have him on the radio. So, like Matt Damon's character said in The Martian, we're going to science the shit out of this. And that's what we're going to do next Tuesday. And it's going to be fun. Really educational show, a different kind of show. And I think it's going to give us some really good ammunition as we're speaking to articulate things in a way that the layperson, including ourselves, can understand. Also, my friends, I want you to know that there's good reason not to give up on the state of Oklahoma. I'm going to be joining Dan Barker and a bunch of my fellow Oklahomans at the Oklahoma City Capitol building. We're going out during the day. I think it starts at 9 in the morning on Tuesday, the 23rd of February. It's Atheist and Secular Oklahomans Lobby Day. And it's just a chance to go out, show our faces. We may, see the press there and make a few statements about who we are and what we're about, to talk about what atheism and secularism is and is not, and most importantly, to show Oklahoma elected officials that their constituency includes a whole lot more than just religious people. In fact, they're probably a lot more secular men and women than they might realize. Dan Barker's going to speak for a few minutes, I think. I might flap my gums for a second. It's going to be a good day. February 23rd. If you want to find out more, you can just search on Facebook. Search for Atheist and Secular Oklahomans Lobby Day. And I'll see you there a week from today, okay? Finally, before I get into tonight's conversation with Dan, you may have heard that Richard Dawkins suffered recently from a stroke, and he had posted an audio clip on the richarddawkins.net website, an actual audio clip that he recorded himself from his home on the 13th of February. He's going to be getting into physical therapy, and in his words, if you have to have a stroke, this is a pretty good one to have. His biggest challenges now are just any functions which require a lot of precision, pressing a computer keyboard or pressing buttons, difficult for him. If you want to hear the audio that Dawkins himself recorded, it is on the richarddawkins.net website. It's called An Update on Richard's Condition in His Own Words. Richard Dawkins wrote the foreword to the new book written by tonight's special guest, Dan Barker, God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction, for which I borrowed the title for this broadcast. The first half of the conversation or so, we're not talking about the book. Dan and I speak about his evangelical past, coming out of, out from behind the podium to become one of the most active atheists in the United States, at the very least, as co-president at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. We talk about the maneuverings of religion and the religious in an attempt to defend the indefensible, and I like his perspective on a lot of this. So we spend some time talking about that. And then the last half of the show talks about some examples from the Bible that pastors won't even touch. They would never be preaching this stuff. Joel Osteen would have nothing to do with the scriptures that Dan Barker highlights in the book. It's going to be a compelling conversation. We'll get into it here in just a second. Real fast, let me first say a huge thank you to tonight's show sponsor, where the snack aisle comes to you. Nature Box, healthier, great-tasting snacks delivered to your door. We're seeing a lot more of this kind of stuff here in 2016, where we decide what we like, when we like it, and then we have it delivered to us while we juggle the rest of our hectic lives. With Nature Box, it's actually a lot of fun to log on to the website, decide, hey, what's the next Nature Box going to look like? What's going to be in it? New options are added every single month. In fact, they just added the garlic bread cheese crisps and the salted caramel apple popcorn. The favorites in my own house include the Big Island pineapple and the roasted Peruvian corn kernels. The sriracha roasted cashews are huge when we're craving something spicy. They're a longtime supporter of this broadcast, greatly appreciated, and I just like them. They're helping people everywhere skip the candy bars and junk food and enjoy an alternative that brings great taste without great guilt. Get 50% off your first box right now when you log on to naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. Snack healthier in 2016. naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. There is a chapter in Dan Barker's book, God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction. Chapter 9 is titled, with one word, misogynistic. And it starts with a quoting of Genesis chapter 3, verse 16. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. When it comes to being eaten or slaughtered, the God of the Old Testament is egalitarian. Other than that, you're better off being born a male. God himself is male, and so are his angels. The Lord, jealous, like the patriarchal men who created him, needed to control women. He could invent no more demeaning insults than to compare a nation or city to a woman, and to make the insult even nastier, a menstruating woman, and to really top it off, a whore. Monetarily, a woman is worth less than a man in the Old Testament, which is especially obvious when the Israelites are buying and selling slaves at God's command. Like slaves, women are property, a vestige of which remains in the anachronistic question, who giveth this woman to be married to this man, in wedding vows still recited in the 21st century. God allows men to have plural wives, but a woman must be married to only one man. The census counts only males. Ancestry is delineated from father to son. The few women who inherit property, if there is no male heir, must marry a male relative to keep it in their father's family. Only males can be priests and approach the altar, while females must wait outside the door. A woman is more unclean after giving birth to a daughter than to a son. Women, not men, must endure a cruel test for infidelity. A woman's promise can be annulled by her father or husband, and so on. Why all this scorning of women? The general answer to that question, of course, is male sexism, which we see historically around the world, but the writers of the Bible, who were all men, try to provide a religious justification for their denigration of women, and it goes back to the very beginning. Adam was created first, and his sidekick Eve was responsible for the downfall of the human race. Blame the woman. Let me share just a bit more of the book, and I do so with Dan's permission, very kind to allow me to read from his book on the radio. But in chapter 6, he addresses the story of Korah, who had gone to Moses and essentially said, as Martin Luther did with the Catholic Church, why is it that we need all of you high priests? Why do we need all of you elevated, super holy men? You know, these people who are our intermediaries between us and God. Why can't we simply have a conversation, a relationship with God directly? And instead of saying, hey, that's a reasonable question, the shit totally hit the fan, and judgment and pain and death and whatnot all came down. Well, he starts chapter 7 which is titled Bloodthirsty, with a scripture out of Isaiah 34:6. The Lord has a sword, it is sated with blood. And the chapter starts out like this, and I'll just read a portion. In the previous chapter, we read about Korah's doomed revolt against the theocratic autocracy of Moses. Personally, I was rooting for Korah's team, maybe because I was raised Protestant. But what can you do when the other team's arsenal includes surgical earthquake strikes? And what had happened is that the ground opened up, and all of Korah and his people went down to Sheol. Korah and those with him and all their families went down to Sheol, and then the ground closed above them. I think God's response was heavy-handed, but it's not just me. The Israelites who witnessed it firsthand objected to Moses' leadership style. Numbers 16:41. On the next day, however, the whole congregation of the Israelites rebelled against Moses and against Aaron, saying, "You've killed the people of the Lord." That's right, Moses, you killed your own people. Shouldn't we be saving our forces for the heathens we will soon encounter over the promised land? Bad move. You don't wag a finger at a furious warlord who just expended magnum force. It just gives him another chance to show off. Back to the Bible. And when the congregation had assembled against them, Moses and Aaron turned toward the tent of meeting. The cloud had covered it, and the glory of the Lord appeared. Then Moses and Aaron came to the front of the tent of meeting, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Get away from this congregation, so I may consume them in a moment." And they fell on their faces. Moses said to Aaron, "Take your censer, put fire on it from the altar, and lay incense on it, and carry it quickly to the congregation, and make atonement for them. For wrath is gone out from the Lord, the plague is begun." Those who died by the plague were 14,700, besides those who died in the affair of Korah. That's Numbers 16:42 through 49. Almost 15,000 of God's chosen people were killed by a super-fast virus, simply for voicing disagreement. The U.S. Constitution guarantees the freedom to, quote, petition the government for a redress of grievances. But don't try that against a bloodthirsty God. Bloodthirsty doesn't mean simply a thirst for blood. It includes a desire to kill or maim by any method: stabbing, stoning, hanging, drowning, burning, famine, plagues, etc. Synonyms include eager to kill or hurt, murderous, homicidal, and violent. But we do find buckets of blood splashed over the pages of the Old Testament, and there is good reason. Blood was the price for atonement. The 17th chapter of Leviticus, which deals with the sacrifice of animals, explains why. Leviticus 17:11, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I've given it to you for making atonement for your lives on the altar. For as life, it is the blood that makes atonement." And then he goes on to list instance after instance after instance, where God essentially bathes in the blood of both animal and human. And they're specifically referenced and documented, verifiable scriptures. He even includes the translation that these scriptures are taken from, and that populates the rest of the chapter. So let's speak to the guy who authored this book and sort of helped to compile all of this so that we might be able to better understand the true nature of the Bible and the God of the Bible. Now, there is a video version of this exchange. I'll include the link in the description box. The challenge is that I think on Dan's end they had some latency problems, or for some reason the video quality is not good on Dan's side. It's good enough so you can see some facial expressions, and if he holds something up to the camera, like a book or an album or something, you can see it. But it's not great. I'll include it in case you do want to see it. That explains why occasionally Dan will say, "Hey, take a look at this," or "Can you see that?" It's because we were having a Google Hangout exchange, which is where this conversation happened. So if you want to see it, links in the description box. But for now, here's the audio of my conversation with Dan Barker. Dan Barker, great to have you.
Hi, Seth. Good to see you again.
Dan, let's talk very quickly in a biographical way. Let's talk about you and your story. I know that you've written about it in the book, but there are some people who are going to be watching and listening who are just now becoming familiar with you and your story. So just kind of give me the Reader's Digest version. Who are you and what happened to you, kind of thing?
Well, I started preaching when I was 15. I carried my Bible to school. I was witnessing. I was a soul winner. I preached my first sermon when I was 15 down in Mexico. We were these sort of weekend missionaries. We went down across Mexicali in Southern California. We thought we were winning this deep, dark, lost continent for Jesus, But I preached and I liked it. And then over the years, I had people come to Jesus as a result of my ministry. I was part of a lot of evangelistic teams. I played piano in the churches and I wrote Christian music. And I was an arranger and pianist for Manuel Bonilla, who's still one of the leading Christian Spanish-speaking recording artists in the world. I went to Azusa Pacific University. It was a college at the time, a Christian liberal arts university. Got a degree in religion with what amounted to a minor in New Testament Greek. But that was a nice school, but it was almost at that time more of a glorified Sunday school. You know what I mean? We didn't get really deep. I think I took one class on Christian evidences, you know what I mean? And we took a class on the book of Romans and a class on Hebrew poetic literature so it was good. It was like a school you go to if you want to be a preacher, instead of a scholar, it was more like a preacher thing. So I got my degree in religion. I was ordained to the ministry. I was a co-pastor in 3 different California churches. A Friends Church, an Assembly of God Church, which is the Pentecostal stuff, which was really quite an experience. And I spoke in tongues, and I still can if I want to. I won't do it here, but I still could. And I found those people to be really sweet and very sincere people, a bit simple and way too noisy for my taste, if you know what I mean. The speaking in tongues and the hollering and the slain in the spirit and all that, and the almost dancing music. It was interesting. It's an interesting slice of Americana to go to some of these Pentecostal churches and see what's happening there. We weren't quite snake handlers, but you know what I mean. We were just full of the Spirit of God. And then after that, I went to an interdenominational charismatic church, which was a spinoff of a Christian church from the Disciples of Christ tradition. Then I was an evangelical evangelist for about 8 years, a Christian songwriter, missionary to Mexico for a couple of years. And I make a point in my book, Godless, that if I was not a true Christian, then nobody is. You often hear that, right? Well, if you were a true Christian, you wouldn't have left Jesus. If you were truly filled with the Holy Spirit, you could never give it up. Well, I believed it. And in fact, who are they to say, right? Doesn't the Bible say you shall know them by their fruits? It doesn't matter what they say, it's their fruits. And my life exhibited all the fruits of the Spirit. I lived by faith. I put my life on the line. I put my health on the line. I didn't charge. I just trusted God to provide our needs. I wasn't one of those flashy, monetary TV evangelists. I really believed it. I thought Jesus was coming any day. And if I could just bring one more soul into the kingdom, that would be on the front line of the army of Jesus for his eternal glory and all of that stuff. I really, really loved it.
Well, Dan, was that an inherited belief? Did that come from mom and dad or what?
Yeah, partly, yeah. Because my mom and dad were deep fundamentalist type Christians who later got involved in the charismatic movement. So, of course, I was exposed to all that. My dad went to Bible school, wanting to be a minister, but he had to drop out. So maybe there was some of that. Maybe I was subconsciously following in my dad's footsteps, and I loved it. It wasn't like I was feeling forced. I thought, wow, I'm lucky. I get to be in the right family, in the right religion, in the right country, and in the right time of history. And it was just all so affirming. It was a wonderful feeling to be a part of something like all of that. So you're probably right. If I went back and psychoanalyzed it, I bet my parents in the community, how can you not be affected by your community and your family?
There was a video on Facebook recently, just came to my mind. It showed a very, very, very young child in a high chair. And the family had all gathered around, and they had taken the child's little hands and they were teaching it to pray. Essentially, the child had no idea what language really was. I mean, beyond just parroting whatever the child was hearing. And at the end, the child was like, amen. And they were posting this and saying, it's so beautiful. It's so wonderful teaching a child at this age to pray. And it's amazing how children so often become these echoes of the actions and beliefs of their parents.
Yeah. And you're so formative then. And when you're growing up and you hear it all the time. Well, look at the Muslims in the Islamic countries, they're reciting the Quran over and over. It becomes a part of the background noise of your brain. It's there all the time. It's just, it just seems so natural. And I suppose that's true with Jews who grow up in Jewish culture, and anybody, Hindus who, that's the way they think about the world. So our brains, I think, to some degree, have to be influenced by our parents and our siblings as well, the tribe that we live within. And once that gets ingrained, it's really hard to uproot it. You probably know what I'm talking about. You don't just, if you're like you and me, you don't just snap your fingers one day and go, oh, okay, it's all wrong, silly me. It was a horrible struggle to have to rebuild and rethink and reshape, almost like learning a new language or learning a new musical instrument. You have to retrain your brain.
Well, I had been referencing it. Someone was talking about how long did it take you? And of course, I can't put dates on it. Doubt is this weird thing that sort of hangs with you in these weird ways, And you have this relationship with doubt over a period of years. You deny it's there. You try to drown it out before you finally start entertaining it a little bit. But you had talked in your book and on our show together about how the fact that you were still preaching for a number of years, right, while you were wrestling with unbelief, or maybe you were just an outright unbeliever. You're still behind the pulpit. You're still preaching sermons, but you're an atheist?
Yeah, well, the Clergy Project has a lot of people in it like that. Well, to be more specific, yes, as my doubts were growing and my faith was, I was swinging from the right side of the Christian theological spectrum, fundamentalist, evangelical, conservative, into more of a moderate. So, you're discarding some things, and then to more of a liberal for a while. So I wasn't an outright atheist for most of that. However, it was the summer of 1983 when I told myself I was an atheist. But I still preached for like 4 or 5 more months. So there were 4 or 5 months when I really was an utter hypocrite. I should have stopped. But how do you do that? I mean, how do you stop on a dime? It's the analogy a lot of us use is it's kind of like, if your marriage is over, when do you actually walk out the door? I mean, do you want to maybe kind of do it gracefully, or if you have kids involved, it's that kind of a thing. So when do you make that? So for the rest of half of that year of 1983, I was still preaching and hating myself. It was just horrible. It was like a total lack of integrity. I was saying things I didn't believe anymore, but the audience loved it. In fact, people were telling me they felt the Spirit of God on my ministry, And one woman even had tears in her eyes. She could just feel the Spirit of God. And I'm thinking, you do? Because I wasn't feeling anything. But and that kind of tells you, doesn't it? It's like a big drama that they're all playing, and they're part of it. People in the audience and the preachers.
Were you a performer? Were you one of the sort of bigger than life? I know Jerry DeWitt can really get his pastor on when he wants to. Were you that guy?
I wasn't like Jerry DeWitt. No, I admire Jerry. Jerry has that, he can go into that preacher voice,
Yeah, the cadence.
Back then, I was talking pretty much like I'm talking to you now, just a regular, sincere person. I wasn't a, thus saith the Lord thy God, oh, the sins of your life. I mean, you can do that stuff, but, that wasn't me. We're all different. But in my music, though, I use music as a vehicle to express my ministry. And so in some of those tunes, I was sort of, musical showmanship, but it wasn't like a big fiery preacher.
You have written songs for ministry, songs that are still being sung and enjoyed today, and you're still getting royalties on some of those songs, right?
Still I am. In fact, I think I have some here. Here's something I wrote for Gospel Light. It's a mini musicale. This was 1980 something for, vacation Bible school classes. And then, hold on here. Let's see. Here's something I wrote in the 70s called Mary Had a Little Lamb. Can you see that at all?
I can see it.
That's a Christmas cantata for children. In fact, adults put it on as well. It's the Christmas story told through the eyes of all the animals that were at the supposedly at the manger at the birth of Jesus. Then I had a follow, and I'm still getting royalties from this. What was that, 40 years ago or more? So I wrote a follow-up called His Fleece Was White as Snow for Easter. And then some octavos and some other Christian music that are still selling here and there, which is kind of fun. I get this surprise check every year from the Christian publisher.
Are they aware of you over there? I mean, oh shit, we have to write Dan Barker another royalty check. Is that what the gist is? I wonder. It's curious about.
But the alternative is that they don't get their share of the royalties because we split them. No, yeah. So, in fact, I tried to get them back years ago, but I signed a contract, and the some of the Christian companies they contract out the royalties up to another company, so they don't even know. They're just.
It's just a number. It's a line item they have to take care of. Yeah. I envy your musical ability, Dan. You've performed at many conferences, and I keep waiting for a wrong note. I just don't hear it. You're really, really, really good.
Yeah, but in jazz, there are no wrong notes. So
No. I mean, you are really, really amazing behind the piano, and you've written this sort of series of songs that are now sort of lampooning the faith that you once championed. Just throw a few song titles out for me.
Well, Beware of Dogma is one of the most popular ones. Beware of Dogma, it has a bite, that one. And then The Battle of Church and State, You Can't Win with Original Sin. I have a gospel song in a gospel style called I Don't Need Jesus to Give Me a Smile. I Don't Need a Holy Book to Make My Life Worthwhile. And then the song that I got to write with Charles Strauss, Poor Little Me. Charles Strauss is the Broadway composer who wrote the musical Annie. I wrote the words and he wrote the music, and that was really fun. Talking about how, Catholics have their beads and the Methodists have this and the Muslims have this. And Poor Little Me, I Only Have a Brain, which was really a fun song to write. So, if you're a musician, you can't not do it. It's something you just live for and you love doing it. Well, you know what that feels like.
Well, I'm a casual musician. I'm a musician in the loose sense of the word, but for me, it's I'm no performer. It's more of a stress reliever. It's been a long day. You just sit back and sort of express whatever. And it's funny how your playing reflects what's going on in your mind and heart at that particular moment. Natalie can tell what kind of day it has been by what's coming off the. I'm just not sure if that's the truth in your home or not.
Mm-hmm. Well, if I need to relax, I play like rock and roll boogie woogie, because that just really gets me. If the muscles are, but I like to sit down and try to think of songs to write, like lyrics. I'm thinking of a tune right now called Welcome Back, for people like you and me who were lost in the faith, but now we can be welcomed back to the human race kind of thing, which I've got a long way to go on that one. But I love that period when you're wrestling with an idea and it hasn't gelled and you don't know if it's good yet, but you're working with it. That's just a great feeling.
Welcome Back sort of plays into this next question, and I will get to the book because this is really the main reason we're talking, but I got the time and I just enjoy talking to you, Dan. Some people have asked me if I'd ever go back. Don't you miss it, Seth? Don't you miss the idea of God and heaven? And there are some things about that time in my life that I have real affection for. But I can't say that I miss being a believer. I don't know. Do you have these conversations, Dan?
Well, yeah, and I agree with you. Some of the people I really love. We still are friends today. And some of those experiences with those people, some of the missionary experiences of being down in Mexico, sleeping on these dirt floors and traveling with these Volkswagen vans through these little villages. I mean, that was just a blast. That was an adventure. And that was kind of fun, to feel like you had this purpose of going out. So, yeah, I kind of quote unquote miss that, but it's like missing an experience from your youth. Maybe it's kind of like missing your belief in Santa Claus. That was kind of fun to believe in Santa. That was like cool. And then when you realize and you grow up and you go, oh, okay, yeah, that was fun. And darn it, it's not true. And you say darn it because, well, you kind of wanted it to be true forever, but it can't be true forever. So maybe some of the musical experiences I miss. I miss working with Manuel Bonilla. Manuel, the Spanish-speaking recording. Do I have one of these? Hold on a second. Yeah, here's an album we did back in the I don't know if you can see this at all, but back in the late 60s. And you can see me there directing the choir in the studio next to Manuel.
That young cherub face.
Yeah, I think I was like, 18 or 19 there. And that was fun to go in and do all that and work together, and then to go out and make the recordings and go out and perform it. And sometimes we'd go to these areas and kids would come running out of the house singing the arrangements that we had put on the radio. And it's just a good, exciting feeling about that whole thing. And Manuel and I are still good friends. We talk on the phone every once in a while. And when I go down to Tucson, we meet, because we realize that real friendship is horizontal. It's like people who just really like each other as people. And real friendship is not contingent on whether you belong to the same club or the same religion or same political party. Real friendship is just two people liking each other for who they are. And you can have that between atheists and Christians or Muslims if you're secure enough in your friendship.
I had a message just this morning from someone who was talking about how they'd lost family members and friends or just disconnected from them over this disagreement. And I thought to myself, since when did agreement have to be the condition for friendship and connection? We can be different people and enjoy each other,
Well, then you have to wonder, is it really a true friendship in the first place then?
Yeah.
If it's so fragile, what have you lost if you lost that friendship?
And does it speak to an insecurity, right? I mean, if I'm genuinely secure in my point of view, I would love to be around people who disagree, because I know that those disagreements will simply splash off of me. I'm on such sure footing. What do I have to be scared about? But if you must be constantly in a reinforcement culture where everybody in your circle is an image of you in some way, I think it speaks to a real insecurity about what you believe.
Yeah, that's true. So, and then the friendship is not really a real friendship. It's more of a, what would you call it? A comrade in arms kind of thing, where you're working in the same army for something. But when you go home, you're not friends anymore. It's like it's kind of like a manufactured friendship.
So Dan Barker goes from beloved pastor and missionary and soldier in God's army to a real pain in the ass to many religious people around the United States who are claiming for themselves essentially Christian privilege. I was talking to Andrew Seidel about all of this. I mean, that's really the crux of much of what you're about. You're not going after private expressions of religious faith. You're going after those people who blatantly or even mildly, subtly violate the church-state line. Can you kind of give me a quick company profile for the FFRF?
Yeah, so we only sue governments, right? We're not barging into churches and dragging people out of their pews. We're not ripping nativity scenes off of people's front yards. There's a difference between free speech and government speech. So we, the people, have free speech. We can say we want, we can wear our T-shirts, we can have our rallies, we can do it. But the government does not have free speech. The government's hands are tied. That's what the First Amendment is. The government has to be neutral. So when somebody who is acting as a government actor starts pushing their religion or violating state-church separation, then we'll sue them not as a person, but as their capacity. We'll sue the governor, we'll sue the principal of the high school or the superintendent or so on. So whenever a government actor is not acting with neutrality for religion, and it can go both ways. It can be promoting or hindering religion just as well. We would complain if it was an atheist principal pushing their views as well, right? Then we will use the First Amendment to take some kind of legal action, to either write a letter or to take them to court.
Well, if you were to hear the Fox News profile of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, you're just the killjoys to beat all killjoys. You want to rob Christmas from those who love Jesus, ornaments and angels on the cross. You're attacking religious belief. You have been in many ways vilified for taking on all of these fights. And there have been questions even in the free thought community about the merit of many of the fights you've undertaken. They think, well, are the small battles really worth the distraction? Should we be fighting the larger battles? You want to speak to how you guys choose what you go after?
Well, there are no small battles. Every single case that went to the U.S. Supreme Court, for example, the McCollum decision in the 1940s, that was just a couple of kids in a grammar school who were being forced to sit out in the hallway, right? And that made huge law, the McCollum case, right? You would think, well, what's the big deal? They're having to sit out in the hallway while this religious instruction is being done in their public high school. So In fact, Andrew Seidel has a speech that he gives, do sweat the small stuff, because it's all important. And yeah, there are some battles that we think we shouldn't take. For example, if a high school has a winter concert that includes a Christmas carol in their program, we're not going to complain about that, because that's one song in a broader picture, right? You can't accuse the school of using the choir to promote religion, right? But if half or more than half were Christmas carols, or if it was being performed in a church, well, then you can see, all right, this crosses the line. This is actually the school having an intention of promoting religion. So we have to look at them case by case to see where they fall. And the Supreme Court wrestled with this with the Lynch decision, where there was a nativity scene at a city display. But it turns out the nativity scene was just one tiny part of a larger secular display. And so the city was not guilty of violating the First Amendment by putting a nativity scene, because it wasn't their intention to promote religion. So you have to look at it. Is that nativity scene standing all by itself on the courthouse lawn and there's nothing else around it? Well, then that looks like the promotion of religion. So
this probably brings into question, too, the historical quantity. This is part of heritage. There are many religious practices, institutions, icons that play into a historical narrative, the heritage narrative. And so you have to probably balance that as well. Yeah, it's a religious song, but they're not singing it in a religious or a church-like context, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And especially if the class is talking about Negro spirituals, for example, which is a historical part of the country. Most of those spirituals have something to do with religion and God. And so it's not like the teacher is deliberately using Negro spirituals to try to convert the kids to Christianity. It's an educational thing. So religion and the Bible and Christianity can be taught in the schools. It just can't be preached or promoted in the schools. And we think if religion is going to be taught, and it can be taught, then the bad as well as the good should be presented, not just sugarcoating it to look one way or another. So sometimes we'll complain about textbooks that go way overboard and making religion really come out looking really, really good and ignoring some of the dangerous effects of the faith.
I'd mentioned the book Godless, which was so instrumental to me. I'd seen you on the road at some measure, and we were talking about the book Life-Driven Purpose. And there was kind of a spin on the Rick Warren Purpose-Driven Life, which is a huge monster bestseller for Rick Warren. I've been given it by I don't know how many religious people in order to win me back to Christ. I found it very unimpressive. What was the feedback on Life-Driven Purpose?
Yeah, well, you're exactly right. It's to turn it upside down. He thinks there's a top-down model, life being driven by a purpose from above, and we all need to find our place within the body or the army or whatever. We need to find what is our purpose in life. And I think the Purpose-Driven Life is one of those books like the Bible that everybody buys but nobody reads. I mean, what's in it really? Robert Price wrote a really good rebuttal to it called Reason-Driven Life, in which he pretty much exposes it as just nothing more than newly packaged, old-fashioned biblical fundamentalism. That's all it is.
Well, it's just fluff, most of it. I saw Daniel Dennett at a TED Talk, and he addressed specifically Rick Warren, I guess, who was in the audience. And as I understand it, by the time the speech was over, Rick Warren just got up and left before Dan Dennett was even done, It speaks very much to a desire to surrender one's own mind and heart, to assign value or receive value from a third party. I need someone else to give me my purpose. And when you think of it like that, it's really kind of scary. You're giving up your will, you're giving up your value and worth to some invisible other out there.
And so my book turns it upside down, life-driven purpose. Instead of top-down, it's bottom-up. Purpose comes from you and me as biological organisms in a natural environment trying to solve the problems of survival and enhancing our life. And those problems, whatever they are, they're material. They don't come from above. They're things that we're dealing with in the real material world. So they're physical problems. So as long as there's problems to solve, we're going to have plenty of purpose in life. And one of the major points of that book that I wrote, Life-Driven Purpose, is that the good news we atheists offer to the world is that there is no purpose of life. We shouldn't want there to be a purpose of life because that would cheapen us. But that doesn't mean there's no purpose in life. And we have immense purpose in our lives, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton working for women's rights, or Margaret Sanger with birth control, or you name it. People who have a problem, whatever. It could be scientific, or it could be disease, it could be war, it could be hunger. Whatever the problem is, you're working on it. You've got purpose in your life.
And you also speak in your own work to the idea that you don't require life 2.0 for this life to have value. I don't require an afterlife, right, to be able to have value in this life. It's strange that many people think this is just a warm-up act. And it sort of, in many ways, makes what we do and what we say and how we conduct ourselves and what we believe and embrace more disposable if you believe in a heaven, I would think.
Yeah, and people like Rick Warren and William Lane Craig, they complain about if it's just fleeting and over, then it's meaningless, right? It's just, it becomes, William Lane Craig likes to use the word absurd a lot. It's just absurd. What's the point of our lives if we live this and then we're dead forever, right? So there's this yearning that a lot of people have to want to live on beyond our current lives. But one of the illustrations I use in Life-Driven Purpose is, suppose you're planning a vacation in a few weeks. You're really looking forward to it. This is going to be fun. Whatever you like to do. What do you like to do? Ski or hike or go shopping or visit friends or scuba dive, whatever. Imagine this perfect vacation. So you're planning this vacation, but then you think, oh, wait a minute. Oh, my goodness. When the vacation's over, I'm going to have to come back to work again, and it's going to be over. So would you cancel your vacation because it doesn't last forever?
Yeah.
Isn't it going to be a blast anyway? And isn't life a blast? And Bertrand Russell said that, just because it comes to an end doesn't mean it's not happy. Doesn't mean it's not wonderful. And we've got it now, so let's enjoy it.
So now here you are, Dan Barker. You're releasing this book that just takes God on, head on. Of course, it's a play on the Dawkins quote, God, the most unpleasant character in all fiction. And I'm sure you're preparing yourself for the hate mail that's going to, at FFRF, you probably have your share of that anyway. Do you? Do you have like a special folder just for all this stuff, all the hate and death that comes into you guys, or what?
Actually, yes, that's actually true. We actually have an email address for crank mail, and we have a file we call it crank mail. And most of it is pretty silly. Some of it is serious. And the police have told us, and the police know about us, and the police have been here a number of times in our building to give us pointers on everything from dealing with phone calls to a live shooter, if that would even happen. And so 2 or 3 times a year, we actually have to call the police for a death threat that comes in, but that's rare. Most of it's just pretty silly, crappy stuff.
Hell threats. One day you'll know the truth. One day you'll burn in hell kind of side. That's usually the stuff I see. It's a threat in the abstract.
Well, yeah, that's kind of basic, but the kind of stuff they want to do to our female employees and the kind of language they use.
But in the name of God?
Yeah, it's pretty weird. You and I know that those nuts don't represent all Christians. Most Christians are good people, right? Most Christians would agree with us that that's horrible. They shouldn't be doing that. But it happens. It does show you something. And we kind of take it as a sign of success. Oh, wow, I guess we're making people think, and some of them are getting angry. So that's, I guess that means we're being noticed. So,
all right. So round 25 starts with the release of the book. Give me a profile of the book itself and what you're trying to accomplish with it.
Okay, so it just came out February the 2nd. Here's a copy I got from the publisher, God. You can see the big name God. And at the top of it is forward by Richard Dawkins. And then there's the word God. And then way down at the bottom is my name, author Dan Barker. But Richard Dawkins' name is going to sell a lot. Well, his name should be up there because this book was his idea. In The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins has one sentence that you might call strident, I guess. The rest of The God Delusion is it's passionate, but it's not like strident, angry,
No, it's reasonably stated and reasonably defended.
Yeah, but even Richard Dawkins admits that the first sentence of chapter 2 of that book is pretty controversial and has raised hackles, where he says, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. And then he goes on to list these 19 nasty adjectives: jealous and proud of it, petty, unjust, unforgiving, control freak, vindictive, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, filicidal, genocidal, misogynistic. He goes on and on and on, ending with capriciously malevolent bully. So he was trying to defend himself because people have been attacking him for that, saying, what does a scientist know about the Bible? You're not educated in the Bible. Well, he's read it enough to be able to write a sentence like that, and such an accurate sentence. You have to have read it to know that that stuff's in the book. So he was preparing a keynote slide that he could give during lectures, where he would have that sentence, and then there would be 19 legs of a spider, like a spider diagram. So you could click on one of the legs, like ethnic cleanser, and then up would pop a verse from or more than one verse. Thou shalt drive out all the inhabitants of the land, for I have given you the land to possess. And so he could prove, see, every one of those adjectives, there's Bible to support it. Well, as we were going through it, the list became really long, more than 1,500 verses just for those adjectives, right? And so he was putting his slide together, and then he said, you know what? This would make a good book. And the pun was intended. It would make a good book. He said, take one chapter for each of those adjectives and make a book out of it. And we were in the Birmingham airport, Annie Laurie and I, and when I was reading that email, and Richard suggested making a book, and Annie Laurie said, hell yes, that would make a great book. So 16 months of work, of getting up before 5 a.m. to work on it, resulted in this. And what happened was I found some characteristics that he overlooked. 19 is enough, right? 19 is enough to totally indict God. So part one of the book is it's called Dawkins Was Right. And there's those 19 chapters, infanticidal, pestilential, and all that. But I had 8 more. And so part 2 of the book is called Dawkins Was Too Kind. And then it goes into pyromaniacal and angry and merciless and cannibalistic. There's 9 verses in the Bible where God is threatening that you will eat your own children. In fact, that's one of the rare places where you find true gender equality in the Old Testament, where God said, you shall eat the flesh of your sons and you shall eat the flesh of your daughters. But other than that, there's not much gender equality in the Bible.
Give me the analogy that you had given before. I saw it on video. I heard it on a radio show, and where you were talking about God in heaven and hell, salvation and hell, in the context of somebody inviting you into their house.
Yeah, I gave that in Australia. I think that's the video you're seeing. So you're walking by my house, and I come out on the front porch, and I say, hey, stop. I got some good news for you, some really great news. And so you stop. You're kind of wondering what I'm going to say. And I say, I've got some wonderful news for you. You don't have to go down in my basement. And you say, huh? Yeah, you've been ignoring me all this time. You've been walking by my house. And I'm somebody. I'm important. And I love you. And you just haven't been paying me any attention. And it made me so angry that I built a torture chamber in my basement. And there's knives, and there's fire, and there's a smelly vat, and there's a furnace, and there's these hooks, and it's horrible down there. But you don't have to go down there. I sent my son down there, and he suffered horribly. It was ghastly. It was a passion of the Christ. And that satisfied my anger. And so I'm not mad at you anymore. He paid the price for you. And so the good news is you don't have to go down in my basement. All you have to do is come up here and give us a big hug and tell me how great I am, and tell my son that you love him, and you can move in with me and we'll live upstairs, and you can tell me how great I am forever and ever. Isn't that the best news you've ever heard?
Yeah, you put it in that context, it just sounds as insane as it is, you know?
So you're walking by, what would you do? Would you just keep walking, or would you want to come up? I mean, what kind of a person are you?
I'd keep walking. So, all right, I'm a theist, right? And I see the book on the shelf, and I don't really read it. I kind of glance over it, read the cover, become indignant, and I start my letter to you. And I say, well, God can do what he wants. God created all of us. We are his to do with as he pleases. Who are we to judge, quote unquote, judge God? What do you do with that?
Yeah, well, if that's true, let's grant that that's true. We still have our own decision to make. Don't Christians tell you you need to open your heart and mind to the Bible and make a decision for Christ, right? They tell you to do that. So even if that's true, what they say, that God can do what he wants, you and I still have a moral mind here that can judge whether or not we think what that God has done is worthy of our admiration. I mean, do we not have the freedom to make that decision? So what we are asking people to do in here is just read it. Here's two leading atheists begging people to read the Bible, because I think if more people actually read the Bible, they'd become atheists.
You know, you had read the Bible when you were a believer, though. What's the difference? Were you cherry picking or were you excusing as you read it?
Yeah, well, both of those, but I think more than that, I was approaching the Bible with a devotional attitude.
So you were deferring right off the bat.
Already assuming, and I point out that John Calvin does the same thing, because John Calvin, when he talked about the killing of innocent children, he even admitted, that does seem kind of cruel. That does seem kind of hard to explain. But since God cannot be charged with cruelty, there must be a higher plan. He's already embedded this a priori conclusion or dogma that God cannot be cruel. God must be good. So if you come at it with that in advance, you're going to be closed to the possibility of even judging whether God is good or bad. So that's the trick. Can somebody actually trust their brain enough to look at God commanding total genocide and commanding and even taking credit for sexually molesting women? I was surprised at some of the passages I found in Jeremiah where God said, I myself am lifting up your skirts and violating you. When the Babylonians were coming in, you know what happens during wartime to women, and God taking credit for it. I never saw that stuff when I was a preacher because I wouldn't allow myself to see that. God was good. Jesus is good. The Bible might look kind of weird close up, but we know there's an overriding bigger picture. Besides, in 1 John, it says God is love. So there you go. How can he be a cruel God when in 1 John, written centuries later in another language, in another culture, says God is love? Therefore, he can't be cruel.
Whenever we were children, they would teach us the story of Joshua, and he fought the Battle of Jericho, and the walls came a-tumbling down, and it was a beautiful children's story about obedience, And they circled the walls, and the trumpet sounded, and the walls fell, and then they just sort of conveniently skipped over the slaughter that happened shortly after the walls fell. I mean, if you look at the verses right after the walls come down, the horrible execution of men and women and babies, and it's interesting to watch the armchair apologist and the professional apologist all attempt to excuse this. Well, it was a different time. And I mean, what's some of the stuff you're hearing out there?
Yeah, well, one of the tactics they use is to say that some of that language was metaphorical or, idiomatic. So when they said they killed every man, woman, and child, they didn't actually mean every man, woman, and child. It was like a phrase like lock, stock, and barrel. It was just a Hebrew idiom. They didn't mean they were killing innocent children, right? But of course, they don't know that. They're just pulling that out of a hat. And in fact, there are dozens of other passages. Well, the plagues of Egypt, the innocent children of the Pharaoh and his, they were killed, right? That's what Passover was all about. How did they get around that? Innocent babies. And today, Jews are celebrating the Passover, their Seder. They're celebrating the fact that the good innocent children were protected and the bad innocent children were killed, right? I mean, it's horrible that it goes on. But
yeah, Yahweh doesn't go after Pharaoh, right? He doesn't go after the object of his ire. He essentially commits infanticide to make a point.
Well, and the point is, and in fact, that's in my chapter, Capriciously Malevolent. What was the point of the first 9 plagues? If God knew that the 10th plague was going to do the trick, what was the point of the first 9? And why 10? Did God have 10 fingers like the 10 Commandments? You think about how the human element here. But what I had forgotten, and I'm sure you probably remember it, is that Pharaoh changed his mind after the 6th plague and said, okay, let him go. So God got what he wanted, but God said, and he admitted it, wait, I'm not done showing you my tricks, my power. I got something else to show you. So here come the locusts. And then Pharaoh said, okay, I give, uncle, you can let him go. And then God said, nope. And he hardens Pharaoh's heart. I still got some more signs to show you, which is like a bully playing with a mouse. It's like a cat with a mouse. It's like, I'm going to show you how great I am. And he keeps saying this. And you can't blame Pharaoh for those last 4 plagues, because he had already said, yes, you can let your people go. So the 10th one really was killing the firstborn children. And there's so many contradictions, because the 1 plague killed all the livestock, but then 2 plagues later, he said, bring your cattle indoors so the hail won't rain on them, right? Well, they were supposedly all dead. But
how do you approach the people who try to make the Yahweh Jesus disconnect? Yahweh is essentially the bad cop. Jesus is the good cop. Jesus and Yahweh are the same, but somehow Yahweh does all the Old Testament stuff, right? The jealousy and the vengeance, and Jesus came to pat people on the head and tell them how much he loves them. How do you approach that, Dan?
Yeah, so the final chapter of this book is called What About Jesus? Because that's going to come up. And I agree with Christians who say that the Bible should not be judged by the Old Testament alone, because Christians have a Bible that has both Testaments in it. And so in some ways, it's true that the New Testament is more gentle than the Old. Well, they were under the Pax Romana, so they were no longer fighting these genocidal wars like back in the Old Testament. And in some ways, Jesus expressed some positive concepts, which we think, love thy neighbor and the golden rule, which were not unique to him, but at least it was being expressed, because the Old Testament doesn't say any of that stuff. The Old Testament is, it's just all about this jealous, controlling deity, right? However, the New Testament is a colossal missed opportunity. Jesus had a chance to come onto the scene and say, I apologize for my dad. He was a jerk. He was misogynistic. He abused women. He should never have been promoting slavery. Slavery's wrong, folks. He should never have committed wholesale genocide. He should never have, threatened that you would eat your children. And that was just horrible. I'm sorry. We progressed. We're nicer and kinder. Jesus said that he came to uphold every jot and tittle of the Old Testament law. He said, I and the Father are one. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And when the Jews asked Jesus who he was, the Jews didn't call God Father. They called Abraham their father. And so they asked, who are you? And Jesus said, well, before Abraham was, I am. So Jesus called himself Yahweh. I am is where Yahweh comes from. And whenever Jesus quoted scripture, he quoted those same scriptures of the Old Testament. It was all rooted in the Old Testament. He wasn't overturning anything. In fact, he fell into that same bloodthirsty mindset. In order for God's anger to be appeased, something had to die. You sacrifice an animal, you kill the lambs or the calves and all that. And there's all this blood in the Old Testament. In fact, fingers dripping with blood. The priests were dipping their fingers and their thumbs and their toes in the blood and sprinkling it all over. So Jesus still fell into that same idea that in order for his Father's wrath to be satisfied, something had to die. Why? What a horrible way to think about it. It's almost like bribing a judge, because God does not forgive anybody unless you pay him off. His anger had to be paid off in some way by sacrificing. Something had to bleed, right? So Jesus gave some pretty ambiguous advice. He also gave some bad advice. Jesus showed us how compassionate he was by saying that some slaves should not be beaten as hard as others, which I think is a little bit of an improvement over the Old Testament. Although he never said anything about slavery itself, he could have saved the world, millennia of misery by outlawing slavery right there. There were no women invited to the Last Supper. The only real women that played any part were the women at the tomb, but then they were told to go tell the men to go see Jesus. They weren't even invited. So on balance, even though the New Testament is a little bit better, on balance, Jesus himself is not much more. In fact, he calls himself. He's not a chip off the old block. He is the old block. He said, I and the Father are one. And so I don't know. I know some atheists who think Jesus was a pretty good, ethical role model. But where do they get that? If you read the New Testament itself and look at it, Jesus misinterpreted the Bible a lot. Jesus twisted things to fit him. When you look at the original context of the verses that he quoted, when he talked about the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, right? And the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. If you look at the verse that he was quoting, that love the Lord your God with all your heart comes from Deuteronomy, where God was preparing his people for war to go in and invade and capture and kill and do ethnic cleansing to take over the promised land. And he said, when you get to the promised land and you live in these cities you didn't build and you harvest the crops you didn't plant, when you take over these people by killing all their kids, remember, love the Lord your God with all your heart. Don't be tempted by those other gods over there. He was a jealous God. So really, that phrase Jesus was quoting of his father was a militaristic, violent, imperialistic phrase. You should love the Lord your God with all your heart. It wasn't what you and I think, this idea of just everybody loving each other. It was still a possessive kind of controlling dynamic.
I know we talked about the torture chamber in the basement analogy, but you get into hell in the book? I mean, do we talk, because obviously hell in the New Testament, a torture chamber, depart from me, all you who are cursed, into a lake of everlasting fire. Do you address the hell question?
You know, a little bit, because the book's mainly about the Old Testament, but that chapter I have in the Old Testament about pyromaniacal, where there are dozens and dozens of passages of scorching, flaming, burning. In fact, God is depicted like a dragon with fire coming out of his mouth and sulfur and all that stuff. Well, Jesus continued that with his talk about the lake of fire and the burning that would happen in hell. So he really was just like his father, although you see less of that in the New Testament. It's still there.
The book is called God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction by Dan Barker. I will include a link to that. It's on Amazon, or where is it listed? Dan, where is it?
Well, it's Barnes & Noble owns the company that published it, Sterling. So you can go to Barnes & Noble, bn.com, or you can go to Amazon.com, or it's in your bookstores.
Wonderful.
In bookstores starting February 2nd. So there should be. However, they're gone into a second printing already. So there's going to be like a 3-day delay if you do it online. They didn't anticipate that it would be such a fast seller all of a sudden. So that's good news.
It'll get people talking, and I think it should. And hopefully it'll open some eyes as to what really is in the good book. You know, maybe for some people it will cease to be just the thing they carry under their shoulder on Sunday or put on the nightstand, but something they actually open up and examine and assess and begin to understand.
Yeah, like they wouldn't walk into church with Penthouse magazine under their arm. You know what I mean?
Well, I know a few, but never mind.
But if they did that, people would be looking at him. Well, the Bible's, the Bible has got a lot of pornography and sexual imagery, and worse than that, and yet people are proud to carry that book under their arm.
Well, congratulations on seeing the book come to completion and fruition, all success with it, and we'll get the word out. And for all your work at the FFRF and for being on this show, thanks, Dan. It's a pleasure to have you, my friend. Well,
thanks for all you're doing as well. We are true brothers without Christ, aren't we?
Brothers without Christ. And I'll see you on the road, all right?
All right, bye.
Thanks so much for listening tonight. Next Tuesday, we're going to get our science on. We're going to talk to Dan Batcheldor, an astrophysicist who is putting together a project that helps us explain things like the Big Bang to creationists. I will see you back here next Tuesday night on the Thinking Atheist radio broadcast, and have a fantastic week.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter. Watch dozens of original videos on the Thinking Atheist YouTube channel. And visit our website for resources, links, contact information, the editor's blog, and more. thethinkingatheist.com.